Economics in general and economics of education. First, some economics in general. It all starts with the household. In the beginning, when human life was much, much simpler than it is today, households were places where both consumption and production happened. You produced your own food and you ate it. But then came industrialization and capitalism, and production moved to the firm. The firm would produce, for example, canned food, and the household would consume it. How production takes place within firms and how households decide on what to consume are key concerns of economists. And when they look at these things, economists are said to be doing microeconomics because firms and households are small. In order to understand the movement of things between producers and consumers, we need to look at things like money, prices, and exchange in the marketplace. Households demand products like canned food, and firms supply them. The demand and supply for canned food interact to produce a price. To pay for their food, households sell their labor to firms. So we can say that households supply labor, which firms demand. Again, there's a price for the labor which is determined in the market by the patterns of supply and demand. Now, when we put together many households and firms to make countries, then we say we are dealing with macroeconomics. Macroeconomics also involves looking at the economic role of the government and increasingly the role of economies on their natural environment. Economists nowadays use a lot of data in their analyses and build rather sophisticated and sometimes confusing models of reality. This very quantitative approach is known as econometrics. Computers have made econometrics cheap and are one reason why we see so much econometrics today. Economics hasn't always been like that. Earlier economists, including Marx, used mathematics to express their ideas, but without a lot of data. And even earlier economists, like Adam Smith, did not even use mathematics. They just discussed things in a rather easy manner. There is a lot of debate and concern currently about the right balance between data and models on the one hand and simply thinking about our world in economic terms. We said economists have spent a lot of time looking at the firm. They've done this partly to understand how the firm produces things. It's useful for us from the education sector to understand how economics sees the firm, because in economics of education, the school or university or even Ministry of Education office are often analyzed in the way the firm is analyzed. The firm has inputs, for example, fresh pineapples and tin cans, which it converts to outputs or finished products. For instance, labeled cans of sliced pineapple. The conversion of inputs to outputs occurs through a production process. A production function is a formula that describes the production process. In mathematics, a function means the same as a formula. It will say something like 1 can of pineapples equals 1 tin can plus half a pineapple plus 5 minutes of the factory worker's time, plus 2 minutes of the time of the canning machine, and so on. In education, the production function would be something like a grade 12 graduate equals the inputs of 10,000 hours of the time of many different teachers, plus the presence of 20 textbooks, plus another 10,000 hours of the pupil's own time spent on learning, plus the level of education of the parents. Note this last part, which is very important in the education production function. In the economics of education, there's a clear realization that education happens not only in the school, but also in the home. And the better the support from the home, the easier it is to do well in school. Of course, these numbers don't really balance. To balance the production function, one generally uses a statistical technique called regression analysis. When it comes to firms, we talk of the production expected in the short run and the production expected in the long run. A description of the short-run production of a firm might be the production we would expect in the next year. The long-run production, on the other hand, is what we expect the firm to produce over, say, the next 10 years. The difference is that when we look at the firm in the long run, we allow for the capital stock to change. So the old canning machine could be replaced by a new one. But in looking at short-run production, we are stuck with the same old capital stock or canning machine. In the school, the old teachers could be replaced by new ones in the long run, but in the short run, production must happen with the existing teachers. In economics, people are thought of rather coldly as capital stock. We have the famous term human capital for people, such as teachers or factory workers or economists. One often hears in economics of increasing and then diminishing returns to scale. This can be explained with reference to a school. Let us imagine a graph with school size along the horizontal axis and along the vertical axis, average cost per pupil. If you have a school with one pupil, the cost of educating that one pupil is very high, if you assume there's one full-time teacher. When you add a second pupil, the cost is more or less halved. Not exactly halved, of course, because the second pupil needs his own separate textbook, for instance. When we add the third pupil, the average cost of education drops further, and so on. This is increasing returns to scale. Though the curve moves down from left to right, what it says is that we are able to produce more education for every dollar we spend as the school gets bigger. But often this does not continue forever. You reach a point when the opposite starts happening. You actually start seeing an increase in the average cost when the school or firm gets too large. The average amount of education per dollar starts to go down. This we call diminishing returns to scale. Why does this happen? One key reason is that you start to experience high coordination costs. You need more management, more systems, more meetings to coordinate the work of, say, 50 teachers. We call these coordination costs transaction costs. Costs which occur because a lot of people must transact with each other in complex ways. Economics pays a lot of attention to transaction costs. All this points to an interesting question in the economics of education. What is the optimal size of a school? If it is too small, costs per pupil are too high. But if it is too large, costs per pupil can also be too high. The best size is somewhere between too small and too large. Perhaps here. Economics is very concerned with efficiency in the firm. Being the right size helps a firm to be efficient, but there are many other aspects to efficiency. We say a firm has reached a point of technical efficiency when it cannot produce any more canned pineapples with the inputs it currently uses. So the canning machine, type of pineapple, type of worker we described in the production function. But if we take the money cost of these inputs and are allowed to reorganize the physical inputs, then we might be able to produce more. For example, we might be able to buy a better machine and employ a more educated worker who might cost more but also spends less time producing each can of pineapple. So for the same money, we may be able to produce more outputs if we are allowed to reorganize the inputs. If we play around with the inputs whilst staying within the original budget or monetary cost, and if we reach a maximum level of outputs, then we say we have reached a point of allocative efficiency. So we have technical efficiency and allocative efficiency. You are technically efficient if you cannot produce more with the physical inputs you have. But you are allocatively efficient if you cannot produce more with the money you have. The difference between the two types of efficiency is very important in education policy. In particular, efficiency is a key consideration when economists say we should give schools money rather than physical inputs. If you give schools physical inputs, such as textbooks, teachers hired by the ministry, and so on, you can only expect school principals to reach a point of technical efficiency. They must do the best they can with the physical inputs they have, and one can imagine there's a maximum level of output that can be achieved in terms of number of graduates, or say the average mathematics test score. On the other hand, if you give the school principal the money instead and say to the principal that he or she can hire any teachers, buy any textbooks, and so on, one would expect the school to do better, to achieve even better outputs. The school would then have the opportunity to reach allocative efficiency, because it would be able to allocate the money to the right inputs. Teachers who do a good job in that school, and textbooks that work well in that school. So achieving allocative efficiency is partly a question of adapting the production process to local circumstances and to the management style of the particular school principal. Since around 2000, what has become increasingly used in the economics of education are various statistical or econometric impact evaluation techniques. Impact evaluations are, of course, evaluations that look at the impact of something. In terms of the production function, one might be looking at whether replacing textbook A with textbook B results in better test scores. Perhaps the most famous technique used is the RCT, or randomized control trial. This involves having a control group which receives no special treatment and a treatment group which does. For instance, the treatment group may have the traditional textbook A replaced by a new and exciting textbook B. Firms and schools don't only produce what they intend to produce. The firm intends to produce canned pineapples, and the school intends to produce graduates. But they often end up producing things they did not intend producing. We call these things externalities. Positive externalities if they are good, negative externalities if they are bad. For example, a canning factory produces pollution, a negative externality that was not intended. Externalities result in costs or benefits for other people. Pollution could result in costs for farmers who must deal with polluted rivers or climate change. In education, the externalities are generally positive. Schools produce individuals who are graduates, but schools, by bringing about a more educated society, also produce harmony, a better functioning democracy, a more efficient legal system, and so on. We call these positive externalities of education because they are results we do not really intend producing when we try and get students to learn and pass examinations. What we have been looking at so far is largely the microeconomics of the producing organization, which can be a firm or a school. Now let us turn to in what economics of education is known as human capital theory. Capital stock needs to be replaced from time to time. Machines in factories do not last forever. They must be replaced. We've said that economics considers people to be capital stock too, specifically human capital. Many of the processes that relate to capital stock, such as machines, relate to people as well. People must be replaced, for instance, because we don't last forever. People need to be made through a biological process and then through education. Just as technology can be more advanced today than it was 100 years ago, people can learn to do things today they could not do 100 years ago. In short, people can become more productive. 1,000 years ago, virtually all people spent most of their time producing food. Today, only a small proportion of human effort goes towards producing food. The rest of this effort goes towards producing other things. In this sense, humans have become more productive. the overall technology is better. Always remember that in economics, technology has a particularly broad meaning. The term technology refers not only to machines and computers, but also to people and the way we organize society. So in the language of economics, management techniques, for instance, is a part of technology. A key question in human capital theory is the following. How does the household decide how much education to give to its children and even adults? Here the concept of opportunity cost is important. The cost of education is not just the direct cost we see in the school. The total cost includes the cost of not working whilst you are educating yourself. This opportunity cost is equal to the wage you are not earning by selling your labor. The opportunity cost of education is high because education takes so much time. In fact, educating someone to a particular level of knowledge and skills takes more or less as much time today as it did 100 years ago. We can produce clothing and many other things faster and more cheaply today than 100 years ago, but the total cost of education has remained high because getting somebody to have a university degree, for instance, still takes around 15 years. And it seems this will not change a lot in future. Economics is very much about costs and benefits. There are costs in educating a child, but there are also benefits in the form of better human capital. There are costs associated with a lot of government intervention in the economy. For instance, more bureaucracy produces higher transaction costs. But there are also benefits, like more equality through more education for the poor or fewer environmental risks. Economics is to a large extent about understanding how one balances costs and benefits. How do we ensure we don't have too much government intervention, but how do we also ensure that we have enough of it? Costs and benefits are at the heart of efficiency. A school is efficient, for instance, if the benefits it produces in the form of education outputs are maximized relative to costs and relative to circumstances such as the average level of education of parents. According to human capital theory, when households take decisions around how much money and time to invest in education, they are in some way performing a cost-benefit analysis where they compare the costs, including the opportunity costs of more education, to the benefits of more education in the form of better future income. More income resulting from being more educated is thus a key concept in human capital theory. The way human capital theory expresses this is actually very simple. There is a rate of return that can be calculated for any investment in education. For example, the rate of return for investing in 4 years of university education in engineering might be 8%. This 8% can be compared to the returns of putting your money in an investment account in a bank. If the rate of return to education is higher than the rate of return to putting your money in a bank or buying a new tractor, the household is likely to invest in education. Actually, rates of return to education are very high, higher than rates of return for most other investments. So, human capital has helped to explain why it's such a good idea, not just for households, but even whole countries, to invest in education. What has been referred to so far are the private rates of return, the rates of return as the household sees them. The social rates of return are what we see if we look at the country as a whole and include the public costs of education. Remember, these are costs the household does not see directly. The household does not really think about the money government spends on, say, engineering programs at universities when the household decides whether it is worth investing in more education. But governments and economists advising governments must of course think about the overall cost of education, including public costs. Social rates of return are lower than private rates of return because the social rates of return take into account the investment by the government. What this means is that it is possible in certain situations for investment in education to be worthwhile for the household, but not for the country or the government. The total cost of a particular education may be so high in comparison to what graduates would earn that it's not worth investing in more of that education. A key area where social rates of return are important for taking decisions is in the comparison between vocational education and general education. Vocational education costs more, but graduates tend to earn more compared to people with the same years of education in general schooling. The question is whether the additional costs of vocational education are justified by the additional income. In economics, one would find the answer by comparing different rates of return. We've covered a lot of different concepts in economics in general and economics of education specifically. The focus here has been on trying to sum up economic concepts that are important for people working in the education sector. Economists working in education planning often end up doing any work that involves data and numbers. Not all of that work is economics. One way of telling if the work you are doing is economics is to ask yourself, has this got anything to do with efficiency or equity? Efficiency and equity are two key in economic concepts when one looks at how governments can do things better. We have looked at the efficiency of the school. This we can think of as the internal efficiency of education. Here the question is how much education we produce with our money or inputs. The external efficiency of education is about how well education converts into income in the labor market. You can have an education system with a lot of internal efficiency in the sense that students learn a lot, but with little external efficiency if the things the students learn are not relevant in the labor market. What about equity? Societies are unequal. To some extent, inequities are inevitable. Even in Cuba, a medical doctor earns more than a street sweeper. But economists advising governments must all the time be asking, how much inequity can we accept? How much inequity is there? How do we measure inequity? Is there a trade-off between equity and efficiency? For instance, if we force everyone in the country to go through exactly the same schooling in the same public schools, will we provide the right education to our most talented students? Will human capital generation as a whole suffer with negative consequences for the economy, which could affect both rich and poor? We've touched on many parts of the economics of education. A few other parts deserve mention. Labor economists are often considered a separate group of economists, though they must deal with many things that economists of education must deal with, for example, the rates of return to education. But in one respect, economists of education need to understand labor economics quite well. Methods from labor economics are important for understanding teachers. Who becomes a teacher? How initial training and incentives and years of experience result in greater productivity in the classroom, and so on. Development economics is a field of its own within economics whose focus is how countries develop. How Korea, for instance, moved from being a poor country to a rich country. Development economics is important for education planners. There is more or less a series of steps a country needs to go through as it develops, and many of these steps relate to education. We need to advance with respect to a number of indicators. For instance, average years of education of the population, the quality of schooling, the salaries of teachers compared to the salaries of other professionals, class sizes, and so on. What can be difficult is to understand how one balances these different indicators and how they influence each other and interact with other indicators in the economy. Finally, the field of welfare economics is important for us involved in education. Welfare economics deals with equity and the kind of society we want. It looks at things like reductions in inequality between men and women and the extent to which children from poor households are able to break out of poverty. It looks at whether the middle class is a closed group or whether it's easy to move into it or fall out of it. Thank you. This is the end of the journey through this talking slideshow on economics in general and the economics of education. We hope the rates of return to this slide have been good for you.